This is the lecture for Chapter 5 of this book, Business Ethics by William H. Shaw, and for the course Philosophy 303 for Old Dominion University. And the topic for this lecture is corporations. As the book notes, the concept of a corporation has historically been broad enough to include churches, trade guilds, and local governments. Corporations can be non-profit or profit-making. Profit-making corporations, as the book notes, can include independently owned businesses or large privately held companies such as Mars, the Candy People, and Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Charters for corporate status were custom-made, giving businesses specific, often typically actually highly specific, authority to engage in well-defined activities. As the book notes, a corporation might have been authorized to ship freight between two cities. Critics of that system of incorporation held that it promoted favoritism, corruption, and unfair monopolies. Increasingly, and especially after the mid-1800s, people came to view the right to incorporate as a basic right of association and one needed for economic growth. People came to believe that liberalizing laws governing the formation of corporations would promote the public good, as self-interested business people would profit from serving the public. Although corporations are legally defined entities capable of entering contracts and being sued, people argue over whether corporations can qualify as moral agents. For example, can we say accurately the following? Can corporations make moral decisions? Can we say that they do? Can we say definitively that they can make moral decisions? Well, whether corporations should be considered capable of moral decision making or more like impersonal machines is a subject of controversy. Some philosophers think that corporations can function as moral agents, at least to the extent that the persons making the decisions for them are moved by moral reasons. Whether corporations can absorb the intentions and acts of individual persons and so be morally responsible, whether only individual persons can be morally responsible, is of course subject to debate. In reality, it is difficult to assign personal responsibility in a corporation because of the numerous persons involved in decision making at many different levels and in many different ways. But if it does make sense to talk about the social and moral responsibility of corporations, either in a literally defined sense or as a kind of shorthand to refer to the obligations of the individuals that make up the corporation, what are those responsibilities? Well, very broadly speaking, there is what some people call the narrow view of corporate responsibility and the broader view, about which I'll have more to say in a few minutes. What is the narrow view? At least this is often how it's defined or described. Well, the narrow view of corporate responsibility, and we're particularly concerned with responsibility in a profit-making corporation, that narrow view says that corporations have a responsibility to use their resources in such a way as to increase their profits while avoiding fraud and violence. In other words, they definitely should follow the law, but they also have a positive responsibility to increase their profits. Who's a good example of someone who held what is sometimes referred to as a narrow view of corporate responsibility? Well, the Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman, who wrote a number of economic books, including Capitalism and Freedom. You don't need to know this, but besides being a Nobel laureate, he was very influential, and he lived between 1912 and 2006. So, what is the narrow view of corporate responsibility? Maximize profits, operate legally. Milton Friedman. Now, Friedman believed that if businesses subordinate profit-making to other goals, such as fighting inflation or, say, locating in economically depressed communities, the businesses would, in effect, be spending the stockholders' money on social causes and not maximizing efficiency. Now, by the way, it seems to me that even under his view, the narrow view, it's quite possible that corporation could do all sorts of things that people would say are beneficial, socially beneficial, including educating their workers, and even possibly setting up private charities, as in case of McDonald's House for McDonald's. And so I think that it's typically in a corporation's best interest to be charitable, and that I think that's the case, and I think it proves it's the perception people have it, and the perception people have of various corporations can affect their bottom line. But there's also, besides the narrow view of corporate responsibility, what is a wider view of corporate responsibility. It's sometimes called the stakeholder model, and that says that corporations have responsibility to all those people its activities can affect. Now that includes, of course, not only consumers and stockholders, but of course workers, suppliers, and contractors, surrounding communities, and even society at large, and the environment, the physical environment. So let me talk a bit about the stakeholder view. The proponents of the stakeholder view submit that modern business is just so intertwined with our lives, and the large corporations are so influential that they should be expected to do more than satisfy consumers and stockholders. The proponents of the stakeholders view say that corporations shouldn't raid pension funds, for example, of their workers, or avoid paying taxes through creative accounting, or reincorporating in tax havens such as Bermuda, even if doing so is legal and enhances the bottom line. Well, some critics of the stakeholder view say that some governmental policies, including regulations and requirements for medical benefits and high corporate tax rates, can motivate corporations to move jobs and money overseas. Our author Shaw correctly points out that predominant expectations for what businesses to be expected to do can change and have changed over time. Right, in the 19th century, there was a concern for economic growth, and there were fewer regulations for corporations, and so it was a different environment in the 19th century than increasingly in the 20th century and today. Let me talk a little bit more about the subject of debating corporate responsibility. Let's look at three arguments for the narrow view of corporate responsibility, which, as we've seen, holds that the principal purpose of profit-making corporations is to maximize profits while avoiding fraud and violence, and of course, while following the law. What's interesting about these different views is they can come from people who are on different parts of the political spectrum. They can come from people who are fiscally conservative and people who are libertarian, but they also could come from people who are even leftists, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Well, let's look at the invisible hand argument, and I've said something about this earlier in the course. And this view agrees with the 18th century economist Adam Smith, and again the 20th century economist Milton Friedman, that when economic agents act in a system of law that punishes fraud and violence and that rewards productivity, economic agents will indirectly promote the general welfare by directly seeking their own gain. Again, think of Henry Ford, who paid $5 a day to workers at a time when that wage was considered high, and created a car his workers could afford. Now, our author Shaw says that many corporations, though, are just so powerful. In fact, that he thinks the narrow view doesn't work, or we should have broader expectations. He thinks corporations can be too powerful to be given a free hand to pursue their self-interest. Whether Shaw is right or not, he tries to illustrate that point of view by discussing what has been called the deregulation of electricity in California in late 2000 and early 2001. And I quote, "For example, California deregulated its electricity market to promote competition and give the invisible hand room to operate. But the result was a disaster. Instead of cheaper energy, the state got power blackouts, and soaring prices as energy companies adroitly and greedily manipulated the market. Each time the state tried to make the market work better, energy sellers devised new ways to exploit the system. The state government only stanched the crisis by a costly intervention that has basically put it in the power business. Well, all I can say is that it's a deceptive example, because California then, as now, was not known for having anything like laissez-faire economics. And the fact of the matter is that during that time, California had for many years made it almost impossible for people to create new sources of electricity, whether it's including nuclear sources of electricity. It greatly limited the supply of electricity. It greatly limited it, and it had done that for many years. And with a growing population at that time, that created problems. A limited supply, and then in what was called deregulation, the people who were directly supplying electricity to consumers had all sorts of restrictions on their ability to pass on their costs to consumers. See, and so, in other words, the wholesalers, the people who were higher up on the chain, supply chain, they were not so restricted, and so that was a real problem. So all I can say is there was nothing like laissez-faire when there was deregulation of what was called deregulation of the energy industry in California. California had for many years actually restricted the number of new power plants. It had made it very difficult to have a greater supply of energy. And that, again, even when they deregulated, or what they called deregulated, they didn't allow the people directly supplying the energy to consumers to pass on their costs. So it's a very misleading example to talk about how a laissez-faire economy would work or could work. So I won't. Anyway, so that's something I want to mention. By the way, if you want to go into that more deeply, you can look into Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, that's Sowell, who wrote about that what I'm talking about, and he wrote about it in Capitalism magazine, and the article's called "The Cause of California Electricity Shortages, Price Controls." Thomas Sowell, Sowell, January 11, 2001. You could go to the internet, look at Capitalism magazine, "The Cause of California Electricity Shortages," and then price controls. Thomas Sowell, economist, Sowell, January 11, 2001. Here's another argument against broadening corporate responsibility, the let government do it argument. Now, this argument says that business corporations are designed to maximize profit. Okay, we're talking about profit-making corporations. They can't be expected or trusted even to put anything ahead of profit unless they are required to do so by government regulation. So this sort of argument, even though it's strictly speaking for the narrow view of corporate responsibility, of direct responsibility, it's typically made by leftists. And so John Kenneth Galbraith would be a good example, and he was pretty influential, especially in the 60s and to some degree the 70s. He was that's Galbraith, so an influential economist, and he wrote some best-selling books. And The Affluent Society, I suppose, is by far his most successful book in the marketplace. He was probably more popular among intellectuals who were not economists than he was economists, but he was certainly influential, and a lot of well-educated people respected him. And so he's another guy who defended let the government do it. The argument for restricting the direct responsibility of businesses was Robert Reich, who was President Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor. And many of you probably have heard of him, or might have heard of him. And he, in the last several years, he has inveighed against economic inequalities and suggested ways of improving the situation. So in any event, John Kenneth Galbraith and Robert Reich, two examples of people who have argued in favor of the narrow view of direct corporate responsibility, and held that we should let the government do it. We should say, okay, corporations pursue profits, but you're going to do it within a framework provided by the regulatory agencies. Now, the two persons I mentioned argued that corporations need to be regulated by government very closely, which should create incentives and penalties to encourage corporations to work for the public good. Now, critics of the let the government do it argument criticize it as leading to bigger and more intrusive government, and they say that the government will never be able to police anything but the most obvious examples of corporate behavior many people find objectionable, such as bribery and fraud. Other critics of tighter governmental regulation assert that the regulators themselves are so connected to lobbyists and to other corporate interests that they can't be trusted. Still another argument against broadening direct corporate responsibility is the business can't handle it argument. And this argument says that corporations simply don't have the expertise to be entrusted on their own to promote the public interest, even if they were so inclined. Further, it says that businesses would tend to impose materialistic values on non-economic matters. In other words, those who believe that businesses can't handle broad social responsibility without governmental intervention think that business people aren't qualified to make non-economic decisions within a business context. It's clear that our author Shaw accepts a stakeholder view of corporate responsibility. On page 170, he gives the leaders a list of what he believes are corporate responsibilities. Okay, and I'll talk about this. Let me talk about it obviously right now. Let's go to this page. We'll go to 170. And many of you may agree with Shaw and believe that businesses, especially large, wealthy corporations, should in fact have a lot of we should have a lot of expectations that they should work for the public good, quite apart from their turning a profit. Okay, so here's the list of corporate responsibilities goes beyond. Now, he doesn't say in my mind, right, but he just asserts it. And this is on page 170. The list of corporate responsibilities go beyond such negative injunctions as don't pollute, don't misrepresent products, and don't bribe. Included are affirmative duties like see that your product or service makes a positive contribution to society, improve the skills of your employees, seek to hire the disabled or other disadvantaged persons, contribute to the betterment of your community, be as green as possible, enrich working conditions. The responsibilities of corporations are not necessarily limited to activities that are intrinsically related to the business operations, but may reflect social responsibilities that each of us, whether individual institutions, has simply by virtue of our being members of society. Precisely how far each of us must go to meet these responsibilities depends largely on our capacity to fulfill them, which of course varies from one person to from person to person, institution to institution. But given their considerable power and resources, large corporations seem better able to promote the common good than most individuals or small businesses. Now, again, a lot of people are going to agree with Shaw, and a lot of people would say that the corporations that do those things are probably going to be more popular anyway among consumers, and that they could get the message out that they're doing these things, and that could redound even to their bottom line. So there are a lot of people who would agree with Shaw, so that's about all I want to say about that. Obviously, there are people who disagree, and then there may be even more disagreement over the extent to which corporations should be legally required to do those things. That's where you'll get even more disagreement over. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is, and I think this is pretty valuable, is that Shaw says that ideally we should educate people running corporations to have broader goals than simply making a profit. and that we should not try to rely simply on law. That law is really a blunt instrument, and it's kind of a means of last resort at times to get people to do things that are socially beneficial, and that it's better to have corporations to have these values of promoting the public good, and to have those values internalized within the corporation, and that we should not rely simply on laws and regulations. And again, I think that I can see there's a lot of merit in that point of view. Okay, and so he says that we need to talk about corporate culture. He says some corporations can pursue profit, and then at the same time they can also do what is clearly the right thing, and sometimes they can even go beyond what the law would require. And he gives an example that, and this is on page 174 near the bottom. He goes, now I don't know, many of you may not, probably were not alive when there was this Tylenol crisis, when some person or persons ended up poisoning Tylenol. Let me just read this. Johnson & Johnson is widely seen as a model of corporate responsibility, especially because of its decisive handling of the Tylenol crisis of 1982, when 7 people in the Chicago area died from cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol capsules. The company immediately recalled 31 million, that's 31 million bottles of extra-strength Tylenol capsules. And notified 500,000 doctors and hospitals about the contaminated capsules. A toll-free consumer hotline was set up the first week of the crisis, and consumers were offered the opportunity to replace Tylenol capsules with a free bottle of Tylenol tablets. Johnson & Johnson was also open with the public instead of being defensive about the deaths. Accurate information was promptly released, and domestic employees and retirees were kept updated on developments. The chairman of the company appeared on the talk show Donahue and on 60 Minutes to answer questions about the crisis, and other executives were interviewed by Fortune and the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so then he goes on to say a couple paragraphs later, in the case of Johnson & Johnson, the company credits its 70-year-old one-page statement of values known as the Credo with enabling it to build the employee trust necessary for maintaining a firm corporate value system. The Credo acknowledges the company's need to make a sound profit while addressing its obligations to provide a quality product, to treat its employees fairly and with respect, and to be a good corporate citizen, supporting the community of which it is a member. Okay, so again, his view is the ideal situation would be one in which corporations, and obviously the people running them, will see the value in serving the public, the value of integrity, values that will go beyond simply following the law and making a profit. And he thinks that to the extent that corporations, the people running them, can internalize those values, that it'll be a win-win situation for everyone, and we won't have to rely simply on laws and regulations. So in any event, and I like that point of view actually, but talking about institutionalizing ethics within corporations without necessarily simply trying to impose on corporations simply through regulations and laws. Okay, now this is all that I pretty much wanted to say about this particular chapter, the chapter on corporations. So this concludes my lecture for today.